Hello there, fellow seekers of the strange and unexplained. Before we dive into tonight's tale, I hope you're having a wonderful day wherever you are in this vast world of ours. Take a moment to think about where you are right now, what time it is, and how curious it is that we're all drawn to these mysteries that lurk just beneath the surface of official history. If you enjoy these deep dives into the unknown, please consider subscribing to Sleep Theories. Your support helps us uncover more of these forgotten stories that governments and institutions would rather keep buried. Now let's journey back to 1981, to a time when the Cold War cast long shadows and some secrets were just beginning to surface. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October 1981, slipped under the door of Garrett Niles' cramped Brooklyn apartment like a message from another world. No postmark, no return address, just his name written in careful block letters across cream-coloured paper that felt expensive between his fingers. Garrett had been expecting something like this for months. His last book, Project Paperclip: The Nazi Scientists America Forgot, had stirred up more attention than he'd anticipated. Phone calls from strangers who claimed to have worked on classified projects, letters from children of deceased military personnel who'd found strange documents in their father's effects, and the occasional visit from men in dark suits who asked polite questions about his sources. But this letter was different. Inside was a single photograph, black and white, showing the deck of a naval destroyer. Garrett recognised it immediately as the USS Eldridge D-173 from the distinctive configuration of her superstructure. He'd studied dozens of photos of the ship during his research into various naval conspiracy theories, though he'd never found anything substantial enough to write about. What made this photograph unique was the red circle drawn around one of the sailors visible on deck. The man appeared to be in his early 20s, wearing standard navy dungarees, his face turned partially away from the camera. Someone had written a single word in the margin: remembers. On the back of the photograph, in the same careful handwriting as the envelope, were just 7 words. He remembers what they buried. Vermont woods. Garrett set the photograph down on his desk and reached for his coffee, noting that his hand had developed a slight tremor. In 15 years of investigating suppressed military projects, he'd learned to recognise the difference between hoaxes and genuine leads. This felt genuine in a way that made his skin crawl. He'd heard whispers about the Eldridge before, of course. The ship had been part of a conspiracy theory that had circulated in underground publications for years, something about a failed invisibility experiment in 1943. Most serious researchers dismissed it as fantasy, but Garrett had learned that sometimes the most outlandish stories contained kernels of truth that the government preferred to keep buried. The photograph itself appeared authentic. The composition, the lighting, the grain of the film stock all suggested it had been taken in the 1940s. But more importantly, there was something about the circle sailor that nagged at him. The man's posture, the way he held his shoulders, seemed familiar somehow, as if Garrett had seen him before. He spent the rest of the morning making phone calls to contacts in the Navy Department, trying to trace the photograph's origin. As expected, he hit nothing but brick walls and polite denials. The USS Eldridge's service record was readily available, they assured him. She'd been launched in July 1943, served in the Atlantic, and was transferred to Greece in 1951. No classified experiments, no mysterious disappearances, nothing out of the ordinary. But Garrett had been investigating government cover-ups long enough to know that the more emphatically officials denied something, the more likely it was to be true. By afternoon, he'd made his decision. He threw some clothes into a travel bag, grabbed his tape recorder and camera, and headed for the highway. Vermont was only a few hours' drive, and he'd learned that the best leads always came from following up quickly before people had time to change their minds or disappear. The drive north took him through the autumn landscape of New England, where the leaves had turned brilliant shades of red and gold. As he drove, Garrett found himself thinking about the patterns he'd noticed in his research over the years. The government's relationship with science had changed dramatically after World War II. Projects that once would have been impossible suddenly received unlimited funding, and brilliant minds were recruited to work on things that officially didn't exist. The atomic bomb had proven that science could reshape reality itself. But what if there had been other projects, other experiments that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. What if some of those experiments had gone wrong in ways that couldn't be publicly acknowledged? He reached the small town of Millfield, Vermont, just as the sun was setting. The local diner was the kind of place where strangers were noticed, and within minutes of sitting down, Garrett had struck up a conversation with the waitress about any unusual residents in the area. "You mean Ellis Granger?" she said, refilling his coffee cup. "Lives up by Loon Lake, about 10 miles north. Strange old bird. Keeps to himself mostly, but comes into town for supplies every few weeks. Always pays in cash, never says much." "How long has he been there?" "Oh, must be going on 20 years now. Bought that old fishing cabin from the Hendersons back in the early 60s. They say he was Navy, but he don't talk about it." Garrett felt his pulse quicken. The timeline fit. If the man in the photograph had been in his early 20s in 1943, he'd be in his late 50s or early 60s now. The right age, the right background, and isolated enough to have stayed hidden for decades. "What's he look like?" Garrett asked casually. The waitress squinted, thinking. "Tall, kind of gaunt. Grey hair, what's left of it. Hands shake sometimes, like he's got palsy or something. But his eyes..." She paused, wiping down the counter. "His eyes are what get you, like he's seen things that normal people ain't supposed to see." Garrett paid for his coffee and asked for directions to Loon Lake. As he drove the winding road through the darkening woods, he felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and dread that always preceded his most important discoveries. Whatever Ellis Granger knew about the USS Eldridge, whatever had happened to him in 1943, Garrett sensed that this story would be different from anything he'd written before. The cabin appeared suddenly in his headlights, a small structure set back from the lake shore among towering pines. Yellow light flickered in the windows, and smoke rose from the chimney. As Garrett parked and walked toward the front door, he could hear the sound of waves lapping against the shore and the distant call of a loon. He knocked 3 times and waited. After a long moment, he heard footsteps shuffling across wooden floors, and the door opened to reveal a man who matched the waitress's description perfectly. But what struck Garrett most was the expression on Ellis Granger's face when he saw him. Not surprise, not curiosity, but something that looked almost like relief. "You got my letter," Granger said, his voice rough from years of smoking. "I was wondering when you'd show up." "Your letter?" Garrett held up the photograph. "You sent this?" Granger stepped aside and gestured for him to enter. "Not exactly, but I've been waiting for you all the same. Come in, Mr. Niles. We have a lot to talk about." The interior of the cabin was sparse but clean, furnished with the kind of military precision that suggested old habits died hard. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows across walls lined with technical manuals and navigation charts. What caught Garrett's attention immediately was the collection of photographs pinned to a corkboard above the desk. All showed the same ship from different angles, the USS Eldridge. "You've been studying her for a long time," Garrett observed, setting down his tape recorder on the wooden table. Ellis Granger poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a bottle that looked like it had seen better days. His hand shook slightly as he handed one to Garrett, but his eyes remained sharp and focused. 38 years, Granger said, settling into a chair across from him. "Every day since I got back, I've been trying to make sense of what happened out there." "Got back from where?" Granger took a long sip of whiskey before answering. "From the other side. From the place they sent us when the field generators went active, and the whole goddamn ship folded in on itself like a piece of paper." Garrett reached for his tape recorder, but Granger held up a hand. "Not yet. First, you need to understand something about time, Mr. Niles. It's not a river flowing in one direction like they teach you in school. It's more like a web, with threads connecting different moments, different possibilities, and sometimes, if you're not careful, you can get caught between the threads." The older man stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the dark lake. "I was 22 years old in October 1943. Electrician's mate 3rd class, assigned to the USS Eldridge for what they called Project Ghost Wake. They told us it was a radar invisibility test, something to help our ships avoid German U-boats. The science boys from Princeton had cooked up a way to bend electromagnetic fields around the hull, make us invisible to enemy detection." "Who are the science boys?" Dr. Franklin Reno was the lead researcher. Brilliant man, worked with Einstein before the war. There were others too, but Reno was the one who understood the theoretical implications. He tried to warn the Navy brass that they were playing with forces beyond their comprehension. Granger returned to his chair and continued. They installed the equipment in September. Tesla coils, synchronized field arrays, enough electrical cable to wire a small city. The power requirements were enormous. We had to reroute current from the entire Philadelphia Naval Shipyard just to run the preliminary tests. And the tests worked. Oh, they worked all right. Too well. Granger's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The first successful test was October 15th. We achieved optical invisibility for exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds. I know because I was monitoring the field strength from the electrical station below deck. Garrett leaned forward. What did it feel like? Like being underwater but still being able to breathe. The air got thick, heavy. Sound became muffled. And there was this green light, this pulsing green fire that seemed to crawl along the rigging and the gun barrels. Some of the men started getting sick, complaining of nausea and headaches. But the Navy observers were thrilled. They ordered an extended test for October 28th. What went wrong? Grange finished his whiskey and set the glass down with a sharp click. Everything. The field generators were supposed to run for 15 minutes, but something went wrong with the synchronization. The fields began to amplify each other, creating harmonics that weren't in any of Dr. Reno's calculations. The green fire spread across the entire ship, and then... He paused, his eyes unfocused as if he were seeing something that existed only in his memory. Then the screaming started, not from the deck, but from inside the hull itself. The metal was screaming, Mr. Niles. Steel and iron crying out like it was alive and in pain. And then came the silence. Complete, absolute silence. No engine noise, no voices, no sound of the sea. Just nothing. How long did it last? That's the thing. Time stopped making sense. It felt like hours, but the chronometer said it was only 23 minutes. When the fields finally collapsed and we became visible again, we weren't in Philadelphia anymore. We were off the coast of Norfolk, Virginia, more than 200 miles away. Garrett felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The ship had been teleported, transported, displaced, shifted between coordinates. Call it what you want. The point is, we were somewhere else entirely, and that's when we discovered what had happened to the crew. Grange stood and walked to the fireplace, staring into the flames. 2 men had vanished completely, just gone, like they'd never existed. But Johnson, the radio operator, he was still at his station. Only he was fused into the bulkhead. His body merged with the metal. He was still alive, still conscious, begging us to help him. But there was nothing we could do. The steel had grown around him like he was part of the ship's structure. My God. That wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the others who came back wrong. Martinez aged 20 years in 23 minutes. His hair turned white, his skin wrinkled like old leather. Thompson started phasing in and out of visibility, like he couldn't maintain a solid form. And Williams remembered things that hadn't happened yet. What kind of things? He knew the exact date the war would end. He knew about the atomic bomb 6 months before Trinity. He knew about things that were going to happen in the 1950s and 1960s. The Navy psychiatrist said he was delusional, but every single one of his predictions came true. Granger returned to his chair, his face grim. The Navy brought us back to Philadelphia using conventional navigation. It took us 3 days. But when we arrived, there was another USS Eldridge already docked at the pier, an identical ship with an identical crew who had no memory of any experiment. A duplicate? Or maybe we were the duplicate. That's what I've been trying to figure out for 38 years. Which timeline was real? Which version of events actually happened? Because according to the official records, the experiment never took place. The USS Eldridge was on routine patrol duty on October 28th, 1943. Nothing unusual occurred. Garrett felt his worldview shifting, the comfortable boundaries of reality becoming fluid and uncertain. What happened to the crew from your ship? They separated us immediately, debriefed us individually, made us sign documents swearing us to secrecy. They said it was a matter of national security, that revealing what we'd experienced would endanger American lives. Most of the men were transferred to other ships scattered across the Pacific Theatre. Some were discharged for medical reasons. And you? I was assigned to a desk job in Washington, processing requisition forms for spare parts. Safe, boring work where I couldn't cause any trouble, but I never forgot what I'd seen. I never stopped trying to understand what had really happened to us. Grange pulled out a manila folder from a drawer and spread several documents across the table. Garrett recognised them as copies of naval personnel records, technical specifications, and what appeared to be pages from a scientific journal. I spent years collecting these, Grange explained. Evidence that Project Ghostwake actually existed. Equipment requisitions, personnel assignments, even some of Dr. Reno's preliminary calculations. The Navy thought they'd destroyed everything, but bureaucracy is a wonderful thing. There are always copies somewhere. Garrett examined the documents, his trained eye noting the authentic-looking letterheads and official seals. If these were forgeries, they were exceptional ones. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked. "Why break 40 years of silence?" Grange looked at him with those haunted eyes the waitress had described. "Because I'm dying, Mr. Niles, and because I've finally figured out what really happened to us out there in 1943. The truth is so much stranger than anything I initially understood." He stood and walked to the window again, his silhouette framed against the dark lake. We didn't just travel through space that day, we travelled through time, and some of us never made it back to the right timeline. The fire had burned down to glowing embers by the time Ellis Granger began describing the details of what had happened aboard the USS Eldridge. Garrett had filled 2 hours of tape, but he sensed that the most important revelations were still to come. "You have to understand the technology they were working with," Granger continued, adding another log to the fire. "The Tesla coils weren't just generating electromagnetic fields. They were creating what Dr. Reno called phase lock barriers, distortions in the fabric of space-time itself. But that's impossible according to conventional physics. Conventional physics didn't account for Einstein's unified field theory. The Navy had access to research that wouldn't be published for decades, if ever. They knew that matter and energy were just different expressions of the same underlying reality, and that by manipulating electromagnetic fields in specific patterns, they could alter the fundamental properties of physical objects. Grange returned to his chair and opened a leather-bound notebook filled with technical diagrams and calculations. "I copied these from Dr. Reno's work log before they confiscated it. Look at this equation here." He pointed to a complex mathematical formula. "This describes the relationship between field strength and temporal displacement. Reno had calculated that exceeding 2.3 megawatts of synchronized power would create what he called chronological instability. Meaning that anything caught in the field wouldn't just become invisible, it would become unstuck from its proper place in time." Garrett studied the equation, though most of it was beyond his understanding. How much power were they actually using? "According to the readings I took before everything went wrong, we reached 4.7 megawatts, more than double the safe threshold. And no one noticed." Oh, Reno noticed. He was screaming into his radio for them to shut down the generators. But the Navy observers were so excited by the visual effects that they ignored him. They wanted to see how long they could maintain the invisibility field. Grange turned the page to reveal a detailed schematic of the ship's electrical system. The problem was in the synchronization. The field generators were supposed to operate in perfect harmony, creating a stable envelope around the ship. But at higher power levels, tiny variations in timing created interference patterns. The field began to oscillate, creating pockets of temporal distortion throughout the hull. That's what caused the crew members to be affected differently? Exactly. Johnson, the radio operator, was caught in a zone where time was moving very slowly. From his perspective, the metal was flowing like liquid, gradually surrounding him. But to the rest of us, it happened in seconds. Martinez was in an area where time was accelerated. He experienced months of aging in minutes. Thompson was caught between two opposing fields, existing in a state of temporal flux. And Williams, the one who remembered future events? Williams was the most interesting case. He was positioned near the ship's chronometer when the fields destabilized. I think he somehow became connected to the timeline itself, able to perceive past and future events as if they were happening simultaneously. Grange closed the notebook and looked directly at Garrett. But here's what the Navy never understood, what they couldn't have known from their limited perspective. The experiment didn't just displace the ship in space, it created a fracture in the timeline, a branch point where reality split into multiple possibilities. Multiple possibilities? Think of it like a river dividing around a rock. The water continues flowing, but now there are two separate streams. That's what happened to us. The timeline split and different versions of events began playing out simultaneously. Garrett felt a growing sense of vertigo, as if the solid ground beneath his feet was becoming unstable. Are you saying there are multiple versions of history? I'm saying there are multiple versions of October 28th, 1943. In one timeline, the experiment succeeded perfectly, and the USS Eldridge became the foundation for advanced naval technology. In another, the ship was destroyed and everyone aboard died. In yet another, the experiment never happened at all. And which timeline are we in now? That's the question I've been trying to answer for 38 years. Based on the evidence I've collected, I believe we're in a timeline where the experiment was partially successful, but officially covered up. The Navy managed to reverse some of the effects, but not all of them. Some of us were left behind, existing in the wrong version of reality. Grange stood and walked to a cabinet, withdrawing a small device that looked like a modified radio. I built this in 1967, based on principles I learned from Dr. Reno's work. It's a temporal resonance detector capable of identifying chronological anomalies. He switched on the device and it began emitting a low humming sound. Almost immediately the humming intensified and developed an irregular pattern. What's it detecting? You, Mr. Niles, you're not from this timeline either? Garrett felt his blood turn to ice. That's impossible. I was born in 1939. I have birth records, school transcripts, military service records, all of which could have been created as part of a cover story. Tell me, what's your earliest clear memory? Garrett thought back, trying to recall his childhood. I remember being in a hospital when I was very young, maybe 5 or 6 years old. There were doctors, and they were asking me questions about my family. And before that, nothing. I always assumed it was because I was too young to remember clearly. Grange nodded grimly. The Navy's psychiatric division developed techniques for implanting false memories in the 1950s. They used them on crew members who had experienced temporal displacement, creating new identities and backgrounds to help them integrate into normal society. You're saying they erased my real memories and gave me fake ones? I'm saying that you were one of the children rescued from the USS Eldridge after the experiment. The Navy couldn't explain how a child had appeared on a military vessel, so they created a new identity for you and placed you with adoptive parents. Garrett's mind reeled. Everything he thought he knew about himself, his history, his identity, was potentially a lie. But why would they send me the photograph? Why would they want me to find you? They didn't send it. I sent it to myself. What? Granger's expression became even more grim. This is the part that's going to be hardest to believe. The temporal displacement didn't just affect us in 1943, it created ongoing instability in the timeline. Sometimes information bleeds through from one version of reality to another. Sometimes people who died in one timeline find ways to communicate with those who survived in another. Are you saying you're dead? I'm saying that the Ellis Granger who sent you that photograph died in 1963. I'm a different Ellis Granger, one who survived because the timeline shifted around me. But I retained some of his memories, including his knowledge of your true identity. Garrett stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. This is insane. You're telling me that I'm not who I think I am, that you're not who you think you are, and that reality itself is unstable? I'm telling you the truth, even though it sounds impossible. The Philadelphia experiment didn't just bend space and time, it broke them. And we're all living in the aftermath, trying to make sense of a world that no longer follows the rules we thought we understood. Grange walked to another cabinet and withdrew a small metal box. There's something else you need to see, something that will prove what I'm telling you. He opened the box to reveal a collection of photographs, documents, and what appeared to be a child's drawing. He handed the drawing to Garrett, who recognised it immediately as the kind of crude artwork a young child might create with crayons. The drawing showed a ship surrounded by green fire with stick figures scattered across the deck. In the corner, in a child's uncertain handwriting, were the words, "My name is Garrett and I want to go home." Where did you get this? It was in your pocket when they found you in the ship's galley after the experiment. You were approximately 5 years old, wearing a sailor's uniform that had been somehow altered to fit your small frame. You kept asking for someone named Sarah, but there was no record of any Sarah aboard the ship. Garrett stared at the drawing and fragments of memory began to surface. A woman's voice singing lullabies, the smell of apple pie, the feeling of being held and comforted. But these memories felt different from his constructed childhood, more real somehow, more vivid. "Sarah was my mother," he whispered, "my real mother." "I believe so. I think you were somehow pulled from your own timeline into ours during the experiment. The Navy couldn't explain your presence, so they created a new identity for you and tried to erase your memories of what had happened." "But why would a child be on a military vessel?" "That's what we need to find out, because I don't think your presence was accidental. I think it was connected to the experiment in ways that even Dr. Reno didn't understand." Grange returned to his chair and pulled out a tape recorder of his own. "There's one more thing you need to hear. I made this recording in 1953, shortly after I was discharged from the Navy. I was afraid I might start forgetting details, so I documented everything I could remember." He pressed play, and after a moment of static, a younger version of his voice filled the room. "October 30th, 1953. This is electrician's mate Ellis Granger, formerly of the USS Eldridge. I am making this recording as a permanent record of the events that took place during Project Ghostwake. If something happens to me, if they decide I know too much, I want someone to know the truth." The recorded voice continued. The child appeared during the height of the temporal displacement. One moment the galley was empty, the next moment he was there, crying and calling for his mother. But here's the strange part. He seemed to know things about the ship that he shouldn't have known. He knew where the electrical stations were located. He knew the names of some of the crew members, and he kept talking about the green fire before any of us had mentioned it. Garrett felt a chill run down his spine. "I knew about the experiment before it happened." "That's what it sounds like, which suggests that your displacement wasn't just spatial, but temporal as well. You came from a timeline where the experiment had already occurred." The recorded voice grew more urgent. "Doctor." Reno examined the boy before they took him away. He said the child showed signs of temporal displacement syndrome, the same symptoms we saw in the crew members who were affected. But there was something else. Reno said the boy's cellular structure showed evidence of what he called quantum entanglement with the ship itself. What does that mean? It means you were somehow connected to the USS Eldridge at a fundamental level. Your presence during the experiment wasn't an accident. You were part of it. The recording continued. "Phase integrity cannot be held beyond 23 minutes. The field generators will overload and the temporal displacement will become permanent. They are watching from the other side, waiting for us to make the same mistake again. Whatever happens, do not look into the green light. Do not let them complete the second experiment." The tape ended with a sharp click, leaving the room in silence. "Second experiment?" Garrett asked. "Something the Navy planned for 1947. They wanted to try to reverse the effects of the first experiment, to somehow repair the damage to the timeline. But according to my sources, the second experiment was never carried out, or at least it was never completed. What happened? That's what we need to find out, because I think the second experiment is the key to understanding who you really are and why you were brought here." The next morning, Garrett woke to find Ellis Granger already dressed and preparing breakfast. The older man moved with the efficiency of someone accustomed to military routine, but there was an urgency in his movements that hadn't been there the night before. "We need to move quickly," Granger explained, pouring coffee into 2 chipped mugs. "There are others who know about the experiment, people who've been watching and waiting for someone like you to surface." "Others?" "Dr. Jean Wner, for one. She worked at Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study from 1941 to 1945, directly with Einstein and his team. She was one of the few people who understood the theoretical implications of what the Navy was trying to do. Garrett accepted the coffee gratefully, still trying to process everything he'd learned the night before. Is she still alive? As far as I know, she's been living in Princeton conducting private research. But she's been careful to stay below the radar. The government has been monitoring anyone connected to the original project. Why would she talk to us? Because she's been waiting for you specifically. She knows who you are, Garrett. She knows what you represent. They finished breakfast in silence, then packed the car with Granger's collection of documents and photographs. As they drove south toward Princeton, Granger explained more about the network of researchers and former military personnel who had been quietly investigating the Philadelphia experiment for decades. The Navy thought they could bury the truth by separating everyone involved, he said. But they underestimated the determination of people who had seen reality itself bend and break. We found each other. Slowly. Carefully. We shared information, compared notes, tried to piece together the whole picture. How many of you are there? Not many. Most of the original crew members died young, often under mysterious circumstances. But those of us who survived have been keeping track of each other, watching for signs that the timeline instability is continuing. They reached Princeton by mid-afternoon, driving through the tree-lined streets of the university town until they reached a modest house near the campus. Dr. Jean Wner answered the door before they could knock, as if she'd been watching for their arrival. She was a small woman in her 70s with silver hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She wore a simple dress and cardigan, but there was something about her bearing that suggested great dignity and inner strength. "Mr. Grange," she said, greeting them, "and you must be Garrett Niles. I've been expecting you for a very long time." She led them into a living room that doubled as a library, with books and scientific journals stacked on every available surface. The walls were covered with blackboards filled with complex equations and diagrams. "Dr. Wner," Garrett began, "Ellis tells me you worked on the theoretical foundations for the Philadelphia experiment." "I worked on what became the Philadelphia experiment," she corrected. "The Navy took Einstein's unified field theory and corrupted it, turned it into a weapon instead of a tool for understanding. We tried to warn them, but they wouldn't listen." She gestured for them to sit, then settled into a chair across from them. What they didn't understand was that the electromagnetic fields they were generating would create resonance patterns with the fundamental structure of space-time itself. They thought they were just bending light waves, but they were actually creating fissures in the fabric of reality. "Fissures that are still there," Granger added. "Oh yes, the damage was permanent. The timeline has been unstable ever since, with different versions of reality bleeding into each other. Most people don't notice because the changes are subtle, but those of us who know what to look for can see the signs." She stood and walked to one of the blackboards, pointing to a diagram that showed intersecting lines and mathematical symbols. "This represents the temporal structure around the October 28, 1943 event. As you can see, it's not a single timeline, but a web of interconnected possibilities." Garrett studied the diagram, trying to understand its implications. "Ellis thinks I'm from one of these alternate timelines." "You're not from an alternate timeline," Dr. Wner said gently. "You're from the original timeline, the one that existed before the experiment created the fracture. You're what we call a temporal anchor, someone whose presence helps stabilize the chronological structure." "But I'm just a writer. I don't have any special abilities." "Your ability is to remember, Mr. Niles. Even with your modified memories, you retain a connection to the original timeline. That's why you've been drawn to investigate suppressed military projects, why you've been able to uncover things that others couldn't find." She returned to her chair and looked at him with those penetrating eyes. "The Navy didn't just find you on the USS Eldridge. They brought you there deliberately, as part of the experiment. They needed someone with temporal stability to anchor the ship during the displacement. But I was just a child. Children are naturally more flexible when it comes to temporal displacement. Adults have fixed neural patterns that resist chronological change. But a child's mind is still developing, still adaptable." Granger leaned forward. "Are you saying they kidnapped him?" "I'm saying they removed him from his original timeline as part of the experimental protocol. It was supposed to be temporary, but when the experiment went wrong, he became stranded in our version of reality." The room fell silent as the implication sank in. Garrett felt a mixture of anger and grief, mourning for a life and a family he could barely remember. "There's more, Doctor," Wner continued. "The Navy has been planning a second experiment, one designed to repair the timeline damage. They've been waiting for the right conditions, the right personnel. They need someone with temporal stability to anchor the process. They need me," Garrett realised. "They need you. But what they don't realise is that attempting to repair the timeline could make things much worse. The fracture has been stable for 38 years. Trying to heal it now could cause the entire temporal structure to collapse. What would that mean? It would mean the end of this version of reality. Everything that has happened since 1943 would be undone, replaced by whatever timeline emerges from the collapse." Granger stood and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street. "When is this second experiment supposed to happen?" "Soon. My sources suggest they're planning to conduct it within the next few weeks. They've been preparing for years, assembling the equipment, recruiting the personnel." "Where?" "The same place as the original experiment, the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. They believe that conducting the second experiment in the same location will help stabilize the process." Garrett felt a growing sense of urgency. "We have to stop them." "Do we?" Dr. Wner asked quietly. "Or do we help them complete what they started?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the dying fire. Dr. Wner stood and walked to a filing cabinet, withdrawing a thick folder marked with symbols that Garrett didn't recognize. "There's something else you need to understand about your situation," she said, opening the folder to reveal dozens of photographs. "You're not the only temporal anchor. The Navy has been collecting people like you for decades." The photographs showed men and women of various ages, all with a similar look in their eyes, the same haunted expression that Garrett had seen in his own mirror. Each photo was labelled with a date and location, spanning from 1943 to the present. "These are all people who were displaced by the original experiment," Granger asked. "Or by subsequent experiments. The Navy didn't stop with the USS Eldridge. They've been conducting smaller-scale tests ever since, trying to understand and control the temporal effects. Each experiment creates new displacements, new anchors scattered across different timelines." Garrett picked up one of the photographs showing a young woman who couldn't have been more than 20. "What happens to them?" "Most live normal lives, never knowing their true origin, but some, like you, begin to remember. They're drawn to investigate the very phenomena that created them. It's a kind of temporal homing instinct." Dr. Wner sat back down and fixed Garrett with an intense stare. "The Navy has been monitoring you for years, Mr. Niles. Every book you've written, every investigation you've conducted, has been leading to this moment. They've been waiting for you to discover your true nature, so they can use me in their second experiment. Yes, but here's what they don't know, what they can't know because they're thinking linearly about time. The second experiment has already happened." Ellis Granger nearly dropped his coffee cup. "What do you mean?" "In 1947, the Navy did attempt to repair the timeline. The experiment was conducted in secret, using technology derived from the original Philadelphia experiment. It was supposed to undo the damage to restore a single, stable timeline. And it failed? It succeeded, but not in the way they expected." Dr. Wner stood and began pacing the room. "The 1947 experiment did repair the timeline, but it created a paradox. If the original damage was undone, then the repair experiment never would have been necessary. So the timeline split again, creating a version of reality where the repair was needed and another where it wasn't." Garrett felt his head spinning. "So we're living in the timeline where the repair failed?" "We're living in a timeline where the repair both succeeded and failed simultaneously. It's what we call a quantum superposition of historical states. Multiple versions of the past exist at the same time, overlapping and interfering with each other." She returned to the blackboard and began drawing a new diagram. "This is why you've been experiencing memory flashes, why you've been drawn to investigate these phenomena. You exist in multiple timelines simultaneously, and occasionally information bleeds through from one to another." "But Ellis said I was from the original timeline before the experiment." "You are, but you're also from the timeline where the experiment succeeded, and the timeline where it failed catastrophically. You're a convergence point, a place where all the possibilities meet." Grange set down his cup and rubbed his temples. This is giving me a headache. It should. Your brain isn't designed to process non-linear temporal information, but Garrett's is because he was modified by the displacement process. He can perceive and remember events from multiple timelines. Dr. Wner turned back to Garrett. That's why the Navy needs you for their new experiment. They want to use your ability to navigate the temporal superposition, to choose which version of reality becomes dominant. And if I refuse, then the instability continues, and eventually the overlapping timelines will collapse into each other. Reality will become increasingly chaotic until it reaches a point where human civilization can no longer function. And if I cooperate, then you'll have the power to choose which version of history becomes real. You could restore the original timeline, the one where you belonged with your real family. Or you could maintain the current reality, where billions of people have lived their entire lives. Or you could choose something entirely different. The weight of the decision pressed down on Garrett like a physical force. How much time do I have? Not much. My sources indicate that the Navy is preparing to move within the next few days. They've been tracking your investigation, and they know you're close to discovering the truth. As if summoned by her words, the sound of cars pulling up outside reached their ears. Dr. Wner moved quickly to the window and peered through the curtains. "They're here," she said grimly. 3 black sedans, government plates. Grange was already moving toward the back door. Is there another way out? Through the basement, but they'll have the house surrounded. Dr. Wner grabbed a small leather satchel from her desk. "Garrett, you need to take this. It contains everything you'll need to understand the choice you have to make." What choice? Whether to complete the circle or break it, whether to become the anchor that stabilizes reality, or the force that sets it free. The sound of footsteps on the front porch interrupted their conversation. Someone was knocking politely but insistently on the front door. "Dr. Wner, this is Agent Morrison with the Department of Naval Intelligence. We need to speak with you." She handed Garrett the satchel and pushed them toward the basement stairs. "There's a tunnel that connects to the university steam system. Follow it north until you reach the physics building. From there, you can access the archives." "What archives?" "The ones that contain the real records of the Philadelphia experiment. Everything the Navy thought they destroyed." As they descended into the basement, they could hear the front door being opened and voices filling the house above. Dr. Wner's voice carried down the stairs as she greeted the agents with polite formality. The basement was cramped and filled with decades' worth of accumulated belongings, but Grange quickly located the entrance to the tunnel system. It was barely large enough for a person to crawl through, and it disappeared into darkness. "After you," Grange whispered. As they crawled through the narrow tunnel, Garrett could hear the muffled sounds of the house being searched above them. They emerged 20 minutes later in the basement of the university physics building, dirty and exhausted but undetected. "Now what?" Garrett asked, brushing dust from his clothes. "Now we find out what really happened in 1947, Grange replied, and we figure out how to stop it from happening again." The Princeton University Physics Building after hours was a maze of darkened corridors and locked laboratories. Grange seemed to know exactly where he was going, leading Garrett through a series of basement passages to a section that appeared to have been abandoned for years. "Dr. Wner told me about this place," he explained, producing a set of keys from his pocket. "It's where they stored the classified research from the 1940s, the projects that were too sensitive to keep in the main archives." They reached a heavy steel door marked Authorized Personnel Only. Granger's key turned easily in the lock, suggesting that someone had been maintaining access to this forgotten vault. Inside, rows of filing cabinets stretched into the darkness, filled with the accumulated secrets of decades of government research. Grange moved directly to a section marked 1943 to 1947, Project Ghost Wake, as if he'd been here before. "How did you know exactly where to look?" Garrett asked. "Because I've been here before in another timeline. Sometimes the memories bleed through." He pulled out a thick file and spread its contents across a nearby table. Among the documents were photographs of the USS Eldridge, technical specifications for the field generators, and what appeared to be personal journals written by members of the research team. "Look at this," Grange said, pointing to a series of photographs dated October 29th, 1943. These were taken the day after the experiment. The photographs showed the interior of the ship, and Garrett could see the evidence of what Grange had described. Scorch marks along the bulkheads, metal surfaces that appeared to have been melted and reformed, and in one disturbing image, what looked like human remains fused into the ship's structure. "My God," Garrett whispered, "it really happened." It really happened. But look at this. Grange pulled out another set of photographs, these dated November the 15th, 1943. They showed the same areas of the ship, but now they appeared completely normal. No scorch marks, no melted metal, no sign that anything unusual had occurred. They repaired the damage? Or they replaced the ship entirely? There are records here suggesting that the Navy constructed an identical vessel to substitute for the original Eldridge. Garrett continued examining the documents, finding more evidence of the cover-up. Personnel records showed that crew members from the experiment had been scattered to different assignments, often with notation that they had suffered combat fatigue or psychological trauma. But it was the final document in the file that made his blood run cold. It was a memorandum dated December 1st, 1943, signed by someone identified only as Director Special Projects Division. The memo read, "Subject, Temporal Anchor Recovery. The child designated Subject 7 has been successfully integrated into civilian population. Memory modification procedures complete. Subject shows no retention of displacement experience. Recommend continued monitoring through standard protocols." "Subject 7, Garrett said quietly. "That was me." "It was you. But look at the date on that memo. December 1st, 1943. The experiment was October 28th. They held you for over a month before placing you with your adoptive family. What were they doing to me during that time?" Grange pulled out another folder, this one containing medical records and psychological evaluations. "They were studying you, trying to understand how the temporal displacement had affected your physiology and psychology, and they were preparing you. For what? For this moment. For the choice you're going to have to make." As they continued searching through the archives, they found evidence of ongoing research throughout the 1940s and 1950s. The Navy had never abandoned the Philadelphia experiment. They had simply moved it underground, conducting smaller tests and refining their understanding of temporal manipulation. In a file marked Project Kronos-1947, they found detailed plans for what the Navy had called the Restoration Protocol. The goal was to use controlled temporal fields to heal the fracture created by the original experiment. "But according to Dr. Wner, this experiment already happened," Garrett said. "It did, and here's the proof." Grange handed him a mission report dated March 15th, 1947. The experiment was conducted using a modified destroyer, the USS Phoenix, at the same Philadelphia shipyard. They achieved temporal stabilization for exactly 47 minutes before the field generators overloaded. What happened then? Read for yourself. The report was clinical in its language, but the implications were terrifying. The temporal stabilization had indeed repaired the original fracture, but it had created a new type of instability. Instead of a single split in the timeline, there were now multiple fractures radiating outward from the 1943 event. It made things worse, Garrett realized. Much worse, and they've been trying to fix it ever since. At the bottom of the file, they found something that made their search suddenly urgent. It was a tape recording labelled simply "Final Message Doctor." Franklin Reno, March 15th, 1947. Grange found an old tape player among the archive equipment and inserted the reel. After a moment of static, a voice filled the room. Tired, frightened, but determined to leave a record of what had happened. "This is Dr. Franklin Reno, recording what I believe will be my final message. The restoration protocol has failed catastrophically. Instead of healing the temporal fracture, we have created what I can only describe as a cascade failure in the chronological structure of reality." The voice paused and they could hear explosions and shouting in the background. "The field generators are overloading beyond our ability to control them. The USS Phoenix is experiencing the same displacement effects as the Eldridge, but magnified 100-fold. We are seeing spontaneous temporal rifts opening throughout the shipyard." Another pause, then the voice became more urgent. To whoever finds this recording, do not attempt another restoration. The timeline cannot be repaired through technological means. The only solution is to find the original temporal anchor, the child who was present during the first experiment. He is the key to stabilizing the chronological structure, but not in the way the Navy believes. Static filled the tape for several seconds before Reno's voice returned, now barely above a whisper. The child was not displaced from another timeline. He was displaced from the future, from a point approximately 38 years after the original experiment. He is not the solution to the temporal instability. He is the cause of it. Garrett felt the world tilt around him. I'm the cause? The temporal loop is completing itself. The child's presence in 1943 creates the conditions that lead to his own displacement. It's a causal paradox that cannot be resolved through conventional means. The tape continued with increasing urgency. The only way to break the loop is for the child, when he reaches the appropriate age, to return to the point of origin and choose to break the cycle. But doing so will erase his existence from all timelines. He will never have been born, never have lived, never have loved. The recording ended with the sound of metal tearing and a final scream that was cut off abruptly. In the silence that followed, Garrett and Grange stared at each other across the table, covered with evidence of decades of government conspiracy and scientific hubris. So that's my choice, Garrett said finally. Save reality by erasing myself from existence. Or preserve yourself and let the timeline continue to deteriorate until everything collapses. When? Soon. The instability has been building for 38 years. Dr. Wner estimates that the cascade failure will reach critical mass within days. Garrett stood and walked to the small window that provided the archive's only natural light. Outside he could see the first light of dawn breaking over the Princeton campus, and for a moment everything seemed perfectly normal. Students would wake up and go to classes, professors would conduct research, life would continue as it always had. But underneath that normalcy he now knew reality itself was fracturing. The timeline was collapsing, and he was the only one who could stop it. The only question was whether he had the courage to pay the price. The decision to break into the Naval Academy archives was made for them when they returned to Granger's car to find it surrounded by federal agents. They watched from the physics building as their vehicle was searched and several men in dark suits took positions around the parking lot. "They're not going to let us leave," Garrett observed. "Then we don't leave. We finish what we came here to do." Grange led him back into the university's tunnel system, this time heading south toward the railway station. There's a freight train that runs to Baltimore every morning at 6 a.m. From there, we can catch a bus to Annapolis. How do you know all this? Because I've done this before, in another timeline. Sometimes the memories are so clear it's like I'm living the same events over and over again. They emerged from the tunnels near the train yard just as the freight train was beginning to move. It was an old-fashioned operation, with boxcars that could be opened from the outside. They managed to slip into an empty car just as the train picked up speed. The journey to Baltimore took 3 hours, during which Grange shared more of what he'd learned during his decades of investigation. The government's interest in the Philadelphia experiment had never waned. If anything, it had intensified as they began to understand the long-term implications of temporal instability. They've been preparing for this moment since 1947, he explained. Building new equipment, training personnel, developing protocols for what they call chronological restoration. But they don't understand what they're really dealing with. Which is the fundamental nature of time itself. They think it's something that can be manipulated like matter or energy, but time is more like consciousness. It has its own logic, its own intentions. From Baltimore, they took a series of buses to Annapolis, using cash and staying alert for any signs of pursuit. By afternoon, they had reached the Naval Academy, where Grange seemed to know exactly which building housed the classified archives. The coordinates were in Dr. Reno's final notes, he explained. Building 147, sub-basement level 3. That's where they moved the most sensitive Philadelphia experiment materials after the 1947 incident. Getting into the building required skills that Grange had apparently learned during his years of investigation. He produced lockpicks from his coat pocket and worked with the efficiency of a professional burglar. "Military training," he said in response to Garrett's questioning look. "They taught us all kinds of useful skills during the war." The Naval Academy after hours was eerily quiet, with only security guards making their rounds at predictable intervals. Grange led them through a maze of corridors to a service elevator that descended far below the main building. The sub-basement was a different world entirely, filled with the kind of heavy-duty storage systems used for highly classified materials. Rows of vault doors stretched into the distance, each marked with cryptic alphanumeric codes. E13, Grange muttered, searching for the specific vault. Displacement casualties. They found the vault at the end of a long corridor, its steel door secured with multiple locks and electronic sensors. But when Grange tried the handle, it opened easily. "Someone's been here recently," he said, noting the lack of dust on the doorframe. Inside, the vault was filled with filing cabinets and storage boxes, all meticulously organised and labelled. It was clear that this archive had been actively maintained, with new materials added regularly over the decades. Garrett went directly to a filing cabinet marked Temporal Anchors, Active Cases, and began searching through the files. What he found made his blood run cold. There were dozens of files, each representing a person who'd been displaced by various temporal experiments. Names, photographs, current addresses, and detailed psychological profiles. The government had been tracking people like him for decades, monitoring their lives and waiting for the right moment to activate them. But it was his own file that stopped him cold. It was thick with documentation spanning nearly 40 years, from the initial displacement report in 1943 to recent surveillance photographs taken outside his Brooklyn apartment. The file contained everything: his real birth certificate from 1938, records of his time aboard the USS Eldridge, documentation of the memory modification procedures, and detailed plans for his eventual activation as a temporal anchor. Most disturbing of all was a psychological profile written just weeks earlier, predicting with frightening accuracy the exact sequence of events that had led him to this moment. "They've been orchestrating everything," he said, showing the file to Grange. "My meeting you, finding Dr. Wner, discovering my true identity. It's all been planned." "Of course it has. They need you to willingly participate in the final experiment. Temporal anchoring only works if the subject makes a conscious choice to stabilise the timeline. And if I refuse, then the cascade failure continues and reality eventually collapses into chaos." Garrett continued searching through the files until he found what appeared to be the master plan for the operation they called temporal restoration. The documents were recent, some dated just days earlier, and they outlined a scenario that was both elegant and terrifying. The government planned to recreate the exact conditions of the original Philadelphia experiment, but this time using Garrett as a willing participant. His temporal anchor abilities would allow him to navigate the chronological instabilities and guide the timeline back to a stable configuration. But the cost would be enormous. According to the technical specifications, the process would require Garrett to exist simultaneously in all the fractured timelines, experiencing every possible version of history before choosing which one would become real. It would destroy my mind, he realized. No human consciousness could survive experiencing multiple complete lifetimes simultaneously. Which is why they've been preparing you since childhood. The memory modifications, the psychological conditioning, even your career as an investigative writer. It's all been designed to strengthen your mental resilience for this moment. At the bottom of the file, they found a final document that changed everything. It was a letter, handwritten on personal stationery, dated just 3 days earlier. "My dear Garrett," it began, "if you are reading this, then you have discovered the truth about your origin and your purpose. I know this must be overwhelming, but I want you to know that you have a choice. The government believes they can force you to participate in their experiment, but they are wrong. There is another way." The letter was signed Sarah and included an address in Philadelphia. "My mother," Garrett whispered. "She's still alive." "In which timeline?" Granger asked quietly. "There's only one way to find out." The address led them to a small row house in a working-class neighbourhood of Philadelphia, just a few miles from the naval shipyard where everything had begun. The house was neat and well maintained, with a small garden and lace curtains in the windows. Garrett stood on the sidewalk for several minutes, gathering the courage to knock on the door. 38 years of modified memories warred with fragmented recollections of a woman's voice singing lullabies and the smell of apple pie cooling on a kitchen windowsill. When the door finally opened, he found himself face to face with a woman in her 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes that widened in recognition when she saw him. "Garrett," she said simply, "I knew you'd come home eventually." Sarah McBride, for that was her real name, led them into a living room that felt instantly familiar, though Garrett couldn't identify any specific memories associated with it. She moved with the careful efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. "I've been waiting for you," she said, settling into a chair across from them. "Ever since they took you away in 1943, I've been waiting for the day when you'd remember who you really are." "How is this possible?" Garrett asked. "If I was displaced from 1943, how could you have been my mother? I would have been born in 1938. "You were born in 1938, but not in this timeline." Sarah stood and walked to a mantelpiece lined with photographs. "In the original timeline, the one that existed before the Philadelphia experiment, you lived a normal childhood. We lived together in this house until you were 5 years old." She handed him a photograph showing a young woman holding a small boy. The child's face was unmistakably Garrett's, and the woman was clearly a younger version of Sarah. "The temporal displacement didn't just move you through space," she continued. "It moved you backward through time, from 1943 to 1943. But in the process, it created a causal loop that has been growing more unstable for 38 years. I don't understand. The child who was displaced in 1943 was you at age 5, but you weren't displaced from another location. You were displaced from the future, from 1981, to be exact." Grange leaned forward. "That's impossible. How could a child from 1981 appear in 1943? "Because time isn't linear, Mr. Grange. It's circular. The Philadelphia experiment created a closed temporal loop, with Garrett existing at both the beginning and the end. He was displaced as a child in 1943, grew up with modified memories, and then discovered his true identity in 1981. The loop is about to complete itself." Sarah returned to her chair and looked directly at Garrett. "The government believes they need you to stabilize the timeline, but they're wrong. The timeline doesn't need to be stabilized. It needs to be allowed to complete its natural cycle. Which means you need to return to 1943 and allow yourself to be displaced. But this time, instead of fighting the displacement, you need to embrace it. Allow the temporal loop to close naturally. And what happens to me? You return to your childhood, to your real childhood. The memories of these 38 years fade away like a dream, and you grow up as you were meant to, with me as your mother." The implications hit Garrett like a physical blow. But everyone I've known, everything I've accomplished as an adult, it all disappears. "From your perspective, yes. But from the perspective of the timeline, it was never real to begin with. You've been living in a temporal echo, a reflection of a life that couldn't exist once the loop was closed." Grange stood and walked to the window looking out at the street. "When does this have to happen?" "Tonight. The government is planning their final experiment for midnight at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. If Garrett participates in their restoration protocol, the temporal instabilities will be locked in place permanently. But if he returns to the displacement point willingly, the loop can close naturally." "How do we get into the shipyard?" "We don't. They'll bring Garrett there." Sarah reached into a drawer and pulled out a cell phone. "I'm going to call them and tell them we're ready to cooperate." "That's insane," Garrett protested. "They'll just force me to participate in their experiment." "No, they won't, because they need your willing participation, and they know I'm the only person who can convince you to cooperate. They'll listen to my terms." She dialed a number and waited. After a moment, she spoke into the phone with the authority of someone who was accustomed to being taken seriously. "This is Sarah McBride. I'm calling about my son." "Yes, I know what you're planning for tonight. He'll cooperate, but only under my conditions. The displacement chamber from the original experiment. I want it set up exactly as it was in 1943, because that's the only way this works, and you know it." She hung up and turned back to them. "They'll agree. They have no choice. The timeline instability has reached critical mass. If they don't resolve it tonight, the cascade failure will destroy everything." As if to underscore her words, the lights in the house flickered, and for a moment Garrett could swear he saw a different version of the room, one where the furniture was arranged differently, and the walls were painted a different colour. "It's starting," Sarah said quietly. "The timelines are beginning to merge. We have maybe 6 hours before reality becomes completely unstable." They spent the remaining daylight hours at Sarah's house, and she told Garrett stories about his real childhood. The birthday parties, the bedtime stories, the summer afternoons spent playing in the small garden behind the house. With each story, more memories began to surface, not the artificial recollections that had been implanted, but real memories of love and security and belonging. As evening approached, a government car arrived to take them to the shipyard. The agents were polite but tense, clearly aware that they were dealing with forces beyond their complete understanding. The Philadelphia Naval Shipyard at night was a maze of shadows and security lights. They were escorted to a warehouse that had been converted into a laboratory, filled with equipment that looked both familiar and alien. At the centre of the space was a metal chamber that Garrett recognised from his childhood nightmares. The displacement chamber from the USS Eldridge. Dr. Jean Wner was there, along with a team of government scientists and military personnel. But there was something different about her appearance, as if she was flickering between different versions of herself. "The timeline deterioration is accelerating," she explained. "We're seeing spontaneous manifestations of alternate realities throughout the facility. If we don't stabilise the temporal structure within the next hour, the entire eastern seaboard could be affected." "Then let's get this over with," Garrett said. He approached the displacement chamber, but Sarah caught his arm. "Remember," she said quietly, "don't fight it. Let the displacement take you where you need to go. Trust that you'll find your way home." "Will I remember any of this?" "For a while. But as you grow up again, the memories will fade, and that's as it should be. Children shouldn't have to carry the weight of adult sorrows." Garrett stepped into the chamber, and immediately felt the same sensation he had experienced in his dreams. The feeling of being underwater while still being able to breathe. The green fire began to dance along the metal walls, and he could hear the familiar humming of field generators spinning up to power. Through the chamber's window, he could see the laboratory around him beginning to change. The modern equipment flickered and was replaced by 1940s-era technology. The people watching shifted and transformed, becoming younger versions of themselves or different people entirely. He saw Ellis Granger as a young man standing at an electrical station and monitoring field strength readings. He saw Dr. Reno frantically trying to shut down the experiment. And he saw himself as a 5-year-old child, appearing in the ship's galley, exactly as Granger had described. The temporal loop was closing. The displacement that had begun 38 years ago was finally completing itself. As the green fire intensified, Garrett felt his adult consciousness beginning to fade. The memories of his investigation, his career as a writer, his long search for the truth, all began to recede like dreams upon waking. But in their place came other memories. Real memories of a childhood filled with love and laughter, of a mother who sang him to sleep and baked cookies on rainy afternoons. He remembered birthday parties and Christmas mornings and summer days that seemed to last forever. The last thing he saw before the displacement completed was Sarah's face, young again, smiling at him through the chamber window, and the last thing he heard was her voice, calling him home. When the green fire finally faded, the chamber was empty. The temporal loop had closed, the timeline had stabilized, and Garrett Niles, the adult who had spent 38 years searching for the truth about his identity, simply ceased to exist. But in a small house in Philadelphia, in a timeline where the Philadelphia experiment had never created a temporal fracture, a 5-year-old boy named Garrett McBride woke from a strange dream about ships and green fire and men who weren't there. His mother was there to comfort him, to tell him that dreams couldn't hurt him, and to sing him back to sleep with a lullaby about coming home. Ellis Granger woke up the next morning in his Vermont cabin, with no memory of government conspiracies or temporal displacement. He had been a Navy electrician during the war, nothing more. He lived a quiet life by the lake, fishing and reading and occasionally wondering why he sometimes dreamed about a ship that could disappear. Dr. Jean Wner continued her research at Princeton, working on theoretical physics problems that had nothing to do with time travel or government experiments. She published papers on electromagnetic field theory and lived a peaceful academic life, though she sometimes had the strangest feeling that she had once known something important that she had somehow forgotten. And in the files of the Naval Academy archives, there was no record of Project Ghostwake, no documentation of temporal experiments, no evidence that reality had ever been anything other than what it appeared to be. The only trace of what had happened was a small child's drawing, tucked away in a box of old papers in Sarah McBride's attic. It showed a ship surrounded by green fire, with stick figures scattered across the deck, and in the corner, in a child's uncertain handwriting, were the words, "My name is Garrett, and I want to go home." But even that drawing would eventually be forgotten, packed away with other childhood mementos that seemed important at the time, but lost their meaning as the years passed. The timeline had healed itself not through technology or government intervention, but through the simple act of a son returning to his mother's love. And in the end, that was the only truth that mattered. Some mysteries, the story seemed to suggest, were not meant to be solved but lived through. And some journeys home required travelling through impossible distances of time and space, only to discover that the destination had been waiting all along. In the restored timeline, there were no men who weren't there, no ships that could disappear, no children displaced from their proper time. There was only the ordinary magic of daily life, mothers and children, love and memory, and the quiet certainty that home was not a place, but a feeling that time could not erase. Hello everyone, and welcome to Sleep Theories. Before we dive into tonight's story, I hope you're all having a wonderful day. Wherever you are in the world, thank you for joining us. If you're new here, please consider subscribing to Sleep Theories for more mysterious tales and unexplained phenomena. Now, settle in as we explore the strange case of Graham Ellison and the lights over Cape Fear River. January 8th, 2007. The morning mist clung to the Cape Fear River like a shroud, and Graham Ellison couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him from the tree line. He'd been coming to this same fishing spot for 15 years, ever since moving to Fayetteville, but today felt different. The air itself seemed to hum with an energy he couldn't name. "Dad, you're holding the rod wrong," his 16-year-old son Tyler said, casting his line with the practiced ease of someone who'd grown up on these waters. "You're distracted today." Graham adjusted his grip and tried to focus on the familiar rhythm of the river. The sun was climbing higher, burning off the early morning fog, and normally this would be his favourite time of day. But something nagged at him, a persistent itch in the back of his mind that he couldn't scratch. "Just tired, son. Long week at the construction site." Tyler nodded and settled back against a fallen log, his attention fixed on the water. Graham envied his son's ability to be present in the moment. At 45, Graham felt like he was always looking over his shoulder, always waiting for the next crisis or deadline. Building houses in North Carolina's volatile economy meant constant stress, but fishing usually helped him decompress. Today, however, the river seemed to be holding its breath. The first light appeared at 3:47 p.m, according to Tyler's watch. Later, They would both remember this detail with crystalline clarity, though neither could explain why they'd been so compelled to check the time at that exact moment. It started as a distant glow, like sunlight reflecting off an airplane's wing. Graham squinted against the afternoon sun, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The light pulsed once, twice, then split into 3 distinct orbs that hung motionless above the far shore. "Dad!" Tyler's voice was barely a whisper. "Are you seeing this?" Graham's mouth had gone dry. The orbs were beautiful and terrifying, each one roughly the size of a car, glowing with an inner light that seemed to shift between gold and silver. They moved with purpose, forming a perfect triangle that slowly began to rotate. "What do you think they are?" Tyler asked, his teenage bravado completely absent. Before Graham could answer, the orbs began to move toward them. Not quickly, but with the inevitable certainty of a tide coming in. The air around them seemed to thicken, and Graham felt a strange tingling in his extremities, like the moment before lightning strikes. The next thing he remembered was waking up on the riverbank with Tyler shaking his shoulder. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Hours had passed, though it felt like mere minutes. "Dad, we need to go," Tyler said, his voice tight with fear. "Something's not right." Graham sat up slowly, his head spinning. The fishing gear was exactly where they'd left it, their cooler still packed with sandwiches and cold drinks. But something fundamental had changed. The world looked the same, but it felt different, like a familiar song played in a different key. "What happened?" Graham asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "I don't know," Tyler said. "One minute we were watching those lights, and the next thing I knew, I was waking up and you were unconscious. Dad, we've been here for almost 6 hours." As they packed up their gear, Graham kept glancing at the sky, expecting to see the orbs return. But the heavens remained empty, offering no explanation for their lost time or the strange sense of anticipation that had settled in his chest like a weight. That night, Graham dreamed of a woman made of starlight standing by the river. She didn't speak, but somehow he understood that she was trying to tell him something important. When he woke, he found himself drawing symbols he'd never seen before, geometric patterns that seemed to flow from his hand without conscious thought. Tyler never spoke about that day again, but Graham noticed his son watching the sky with new intensity, as if waiting for something to return. 3 days later, Graham posted his experience on a local UFO forum, describing the lights and the missing time. He used a pseudonym and kept the details vague, but the response was immediate and unsettling. Within hours, his post had been viewed hundreds of times and generated dozens of responses from people claiming similar experiences. What Graham didn't know was that his post had also been flagged by automated systems monitoring internet traffic for specific keywords. In a windowless office in Virginia, a junior analyst highlighted Graham's account and forwarded it to a supervisor with a note: "Possible Class C encounter. Recommend monitoring." The wheels of a vast machinery had begun to turn, and Graham Ellison was about to discover that some experiences are too significant to remain private. Spring 2007. The first sign that Graham's life was about to change came on a Tuesday morning in March. He was reviewing blueprints for a new subdivision when he noticed a black SUV parked across from his office. The windows were tinted dark enough to hide the occupants, and the license plate was generic government issue. Graham had served 2 tours in Iraq before settling into civilian life, and his military instincts were still sharp. The SUV's positioning gave its occupants a clear view of both his office and his home. This wasn't a coincidence. By Thursday, there were 2 vehicles rotating in shifts. Professional surveillance, discreet but not invisible. Graham began taking different routes home, checking his rearview mirror, and noting the faces of strangers who lingered too long in his neighbourhood. The direct approach came on a Friday evening. Graham was working late when 2 men in unremarkable suits entered his office. One was tall and thin with prematurely grey hair, the other shorter and stockier, with the kind of tan that came from desk work under fluorescent lights. "Mr. Ellison," tall one said, "I'm Dr. Michael Stevens, and this is my colleague Dr. James Park. We're researchers from the Environmental Protection Agency. We understand you had an unusual experience near the Cape Fear River in January. Graham's hand moved instinctively toward the drawer where he kept a loaded pistol. I never mentioned anything to the EPA. Internet forums are public record, Dr. Park said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Your post was quite detailed. We're part of a task force investigating unusual environmental phenomena in the region. There have been several reports of unexplained lights and electromagnetic anomalies. I see. Graham kept his voice neutral. And you want to know what I saw? We'd like to study the area where you had your experience, Dr. Stevens said. With your permission, of course. We'd like to take soil samples, check for radiation levels, that sort of thing. Purely scientific. Graham studied their faces. Both men had the look of people who spent their lives in offices and conference rooms, but there was something else there too. A hunger, an intensity that didn't match their bureaucratic cover story. What kind of environmental phenomena? He asked. Magnetic anomalies mostly, Dr. Park said. Solar flare activity can sometimes create unusual atmospheric effects. We're trying to determine if there's a pattern. It was a reasonable explanation, but Graham's instincts were screaming that these men were lying. Still, he found himself nodding. I suppose that would be all right. When did you want to do this? Tomorrow morning, if possible. We won't disturb your property, just the riverbank area where you reported the sighting. After they left, Graham sat in his office for a long time, staring at the business card doctor Stevens had given him. The EPA logo looked authentic, but the phone number went to a generic voicemail system. He tried calling the main EPA office and asking for Dr. Stevens, but was told no one by that name worked there. The next morning, Graham drove to the river to watch the researchers work. They arrived in a white van loaded with equipment that looked more sophisticated than anything the EPA would use for a routine environmental survey. Both men wore hazmat suits and carried devices that beeped and clicked as they moved around the area. Finding anything interesting? Graham asked. Dr. Stevens looked up from a tablet displaying what appeared to be wavelength readings. Some elevated electromagnetic activity, but nothing dangerous. The soil composition is unusual, though. Higher than normal levels of rare earth elements. What does that mean? Probably nothing, Dr. Park said. Could be natural deposits or runoff from industrial activity upstream. They worked for 3 hours, taking samples and recording measurements. Before leaving, Dr. Stevens approached Graham with a small device about the size of a smartphone. We'd like to leave this sensor here for a few days, he said. It'll monitor electromagnetic fluctuations and help us build a baseline for the area. Is that all right? Graham took the device and examined it. It was heavier than it looked, with a small LED that pulsed blue every few seconds. How long do you need it? A week, maybe 2. We'll come back to collect it. After they left, Graham clipped the sensor to a tree branch near the spot where he'd seen the lights. It seemed harmless enough, but that night he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. 3 days later, his neighbour's dog started acting strangely. The normally friendly retriever would bark frantically whenever it got near the sensor, and refused to go anywhere near the river. Graham's own sleep became restless, filled with dreams of the Starlight Woman and geometric patterns that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. On the 4th night, Graham woke to find the sensor glowing brighter than usual. He walked to his window and saw that it was emitting a steady beam of light toward the sky. When he went outside to investigate, the device fell silent and dark the moment he approached. The next morning, Graham examined the sensor more carefully. Hidden beneath its official-looking casing, he found a small label, Property of Halford Dynamics, Classified Research Division. A quick internet search revealed that Halford Dynamics was a defence contractor specialising in aerospace technology and electronic surveillance. They had major contracts with the Pentagon and several 3-letter agencies. Graham carefully removed the sensor from the tree and drove to the public library, where he used one of their computers to research Halford Dynamics more thoroughly. What he found made his blood run cold. The company had been involved in several black projects related to exotic propulsion systems, and what their website euphemistically called consciousness interface technology. There were references to contracts with the Defense Intelligence Agency and something called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. When Graham returned home, he found the sensor exactly where he'd left it, clipped to the same branch. He was certain he'd taken it with him, but there it was. pulsing its blue light as if nothing had happened. That night he dreamed of the Starlight Woman again. This time she spoke. "They're listening," she said in a voice like wind through leaves, "but they don't understand what they're hearing. Be careful, Graham. The beacon has been lit, and they will come." When he woke, Graham found fresh symbols drawn on the notepad beside his bed. His hand was stained with ink, though he had no memory of drawing anything. The symbols looked like a warning. September 2007. Rowan Knox had been investigating government secrecy for 12 years, but she'd never encountered a case quite like Graham Ellison's. The freelance journalist had built her reputation on meticulous research and an almost supernatural ability to navigate the labyrinthine world of classified documents and redacted files. Her interest in the Ellison case began with a routine Freedom of Information Act request. She'd been researching electromagnetic anomalies in North Carolina for an article about environmental cover-ups, when Graham's name appeared in a Defense Intelligence Agency database titled Anomalous Human Contact Events, Classification Restricted. The file was heavily redacted, but what remained was tantalizing. References to biological harmonics, message-receptive conditions, and something called Project Threshold. Most intriguingly, there were multiple references to a beacon subject, whose neurological patterns indicate enhanced sensitivity to non-terrestrial communications. Rowan had seen enough government documents to recognise the language of black projects. This wasn't environmental research or weather phenomena. This was something far more exotic. She began with public records, tracing Graham's military service, his business dealings, and his family history. On paper, he was exactly what he appeared to be, a working-class veteran who'd built a modest construction business and raised 4 children in rural North Carolina. But the government's interest in him suggested there was more to the story. The breakthrough came when she interviewed Dr. Sarah Chen, a former Pentagon researcher who'd left government service after becoming disillusioned with the military's approach to unexplained phenomena. They met at a coffee shop in Arlington, Virginia, where Chen spoke in careful, measured tones about her work on something called the Consciousness Interface Project. "We were studying people who claimed to have had contact with unexplained intelligences," Chen explained. "Not abduction cases, but something more subtle. People who reported receiving information through dreams, visions, or direct mental contact. Information about what? Future events, mostly. Technological developments, environmental changes, sometimes geopolitical shifts. The accuracy rate was surprisingly high, but the subjects were often dismissed as delusional or attention-seeking," Rowan leaned forward. "What made them different?" "Neurological anomalies," Chen said. "Specific patterns in their brain activity that we couldn't explain. It was as if their consciousness was operating on a different frequency than normal humans." "And Graham Ellison?" Chen's expression grew guarded. "I can't discuss specific cases, but I will say that some subjects were more receptive than others. A few seemed to be in direct communication with intelligences that demonstrated knowledge beyond current human understanding. What happened to the project? It was transferred to a different agency, above my clearance level, but I heard rumours that it became part of something larger, something that involved monitoring these individuals indefinitely." After the interview, Rowan spent weeks trying to verify Chen's claims. She contacted other former government researchers, many of whom refused to speak on the record. But gradually, a picture emerged of a secret program that had been studying human consciousness and its potential for contact with non-human intelligence. The program had multiple names over the years: Project Threshold, the Consciousness Interface Project, and most recently something called the Observer Initiative. The common thread was the identification and monitoring of individuals who displayed unusual sensitivity to what the documents euphemistically called anomalous information sources. Rowan's investigation led her to a small community of researchers and experiencers who communicated through encrypted forums and private conferences. They called themselves the Network, and they were united by a shared belief that the government was actively suppressing evidence of non-human intelligence. Through the network, Rowan learned that Graham Ellison wasn't alone. There were dozens of similar cases scattered across the country, all involving individuals who'd had contact with unexplained lights or entities and subsequently found themselves under government surveillance. The pattern was always the same. initial contact with anomalous phenomena, followed by a period of enhanced psychic sensitivity, then the arrival of government researchers claiming to study environmental or psychological effects. The subjects were never arrested or directly threatened, but their lives were quietly monitored and their activities tracked. "They're not trying to silence us," one experiencer told Rowan during an encrypted phone call. "They're studying us, like lab rats." Studying you for what? To understand how the contact works. They want to know how to communicate with them directly, without needing people like us as intermediaries. The pieces began to fall into place. The government wasn't covering up evidence of non-human intelligence. They were trying to weaponize it. The experiencers weren't being silenced. They were being used as unwitting research subjects in a program designed to establish direct communication with entities that seemed to exist outside normal human understanding. Rowan's investigation took on new urgency when she discovered that Graham Ellison's case was considered particularly significant. Unlike other experiencers who reported sporadic contact or vague impressions, Graham appeared to be in ongoing communication with what the files referred to as the primary source. The document suggested that Graham was receiving specific information about future events, and that this information had proven remarkably accurate. One heavily redacted memo mentioned prophetic accuracy rates exceeding 85% and recommended immediate escalation to Umbra clearance levels. Rowan had never heard of Umbra clearance, but her sources suggested it was reserved for the most sensitive intelligence operations. Whatever Graham Ellison was experiencing, it had attracted the attention of the highest levels of the intelligence community. The journalist's investigation was interrupted when she returned to her apartment one evening to find her door slightly ajar. Nothing had been stolen, but her research materials had been carefully examined and photographed. On her desk she found a single business card with no name or title, just a phone number and the words, "We should talk." When she called the number, a man with a slight southern accent answered on the first ring. "Ms. Knox," he said. "I believe you've been asking questions about Graham Ellison. Who is this?" "Someone who shares your interest in the truth. But I should warn you, the truth about Mr. Ellison is more complicated than you realise. There are forces at work that go beyond simple government surveillance." "What kind of forces?" "The kind that have been watching humanity for a very long time, and they're becoming more active. Mr. Ellison is just the beginning." The line went dead, leaving Rowan staring at her phone and wondering if she'd stumbled onto something far more significant than she'd imagined. Over the following weeks, she noticed signs of surveillance around her own apartment. Black SUVs with tinted windows, strangers who seemed to be photographing her building, electronic interference with her phone and computer. She was being watched, just like Graham Ellison. But unlike Graham, Rowan had no contact with mysterious entities or prophetic visions. She was simply a journalist asking inconvenient questions, which meant that the government's interest in her case was sending a different message. They were serious about protecting their secret, and they were willing to intimidate anyone who got too close to the truth. Rowan realised that she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Her investigation had evolved from a simple story about government secrecy to something that threatened to expose one of the most closely guarded secrets in human history. The question was, what was she going to do about it? December 2007. Dr. Elias Wren had spent his entire career searching for the intersection between consciousness and quantum mechanics, but he'd never expected to find it in a government file marked "Classified Eyes Only." The physicist had been recruited from his position at MIT 3 months earlier, ostensibly to consult on exotic propulsion systems for the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. The reality was far more intriguing. Wren's real assignment was to evaluate the scientific implications of Project Threshold, a classified program that had been monitoring individuals with apparent psychic abilities since the 1970s. The project had produced thousands of pages of documentation, but very little in the way of concrete results, until Graham Ellison. The Ellison file occupied an entire cabinet in the secure facility where Wren worked, a nondescript office building in Langley, Virginia. The case was unique in the history of the project. An ordinary civilian who'd experienced contact with unknown intelligences and subsequently demonstrated abilities that defied conventional understanding of human consciousness. "What makes this case different?" Wren asked his supervisor. Major Lyle Granger, during their first briefing. Granger was a career intelligence officer who'd transitioned from military service to civilian contracting after the Iraq War. His manner was professional but guarded, and Wren got the impression that the Major was more comfortable dealing with foreign adversaries than domestic anomalies. Accuracy, Granger said simply. Every other subject we've studied shows sporadic hits mixed with obvious misses. Ellison is batting nearly perfect. Perfect at what? Predicting future events, technical developments, political changes, environmental disasters. He's been right about things that hadn't even been planned yet when he made his predictions. Wren studied the file. Graham's visions had indeed been remarkably prescient. In the months following his river encounter, he'd predicted a major oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, described advances in military drone technology that wouldn't be publicly revealed for years, and accurately forecast the outcome of several congressional elections. How is he getting this information? That's what we want you to determine, Granger said. Is it psychic ability, foreign intelligence, or something else entirely? And if it's something else, Granger's expression grew serious, then we need to understand it before someone else does. Wren spent weeks analysing the data, looking for patterns that might explain Graham's abilities. The man's brain scans showed unusual activity in the temporal lobe, but nothing that would typically be associated with psychic phenomena. His background check revealed no connections to foreign intelligence services or access to classified information. The breakthrough came when Wren examined the electromagnetic readings from the sensor devices that had been placed around Graham's property. The data showed periodic bursts of extremely low frequency waves that seemed to correlate with the timing of Graham's most accurate predictions. It's like he's receiving radio transmissions, Wren told Granger during their weekly meeting. But the frequency is so low that it would require a massive antenna to generate naturally. Could it be artificial? The power requirements would be enormous. You'd need something the size of a small city to generate this kind of signal, or something not bound by our understanding of physics. The possibility that Graham was in contact with non-human intelligence was the elephant in the room that no one wanted to discuss directly. But as Wren dug deeper into the data, it became increasingly difficult to ignore. The decision to make direct contact with Graham came from above Granger's pay grade. Wren was authorised to travel to North Carolina and conduct an interview, but with strict parameters. He was to present himself as a university researcher studying electromagnetic anomalies, not a government contractor investigating alien contact. Graham agreed to meet at a diner in Fayetteville, a public place where he'd feel comfortable. Wren arrived early and studied the man who walked through the door. Graham Ellison looked exactly like his photographs, a working-class veteran with calloused hands and cautious eyes. But there was something else there too, a quality that Wren couldn't quite define. "Mr. Ellison," Wren said, extending his hand. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." "Dr. Wren," Graham replied, his handshake firm but brief. "I have to say, I'm getting tired of talking to researchers." "I understand you've had several visitors recently. EPA, Air Force, even someone claiming to be from the Smithsonian. They all want to know about the lights I saw, but none of them seem interested in helping me understand what happened." Wren ordered coffee and studied Graham's face. The man was tired, stressed, and clearly suspicious of yet another government researcher. But there was something else there too, a sense of purpose, as if Graham was carrying knowledge that he couldn't quite articulate. "What do you think happened to you?" Wren asked. Graham was quiet for a long moment. "Honestly, I think I made contact with something that's been trying to communicate with humanity for a long time, and I think your government is more interested in controlling that communication than understanding it." "What makes you say that?" "Because every time I have a vision or a dream about the future, you people show up to ask questions. It's like you're monitoring me somehow." Wren felt a chill. Graham wasn't supposed to be aware of the surveillance. What kind of visions? Things that are going to happen, problems that need to be solved. Sometimes I wake up with technical specifications for devices I've never seen before. Graham pulled a notebook from his jacket and showed Wren a page filled with detailed diagrams. "Tell me, Doctor. Wren, what do you think this is?" Wren studied the drawings. They appeared to be schematics for some kind of energy generation system, but the physics involved were beyond current human understanding. The designs incorporated principles that wouldn't be discovered for decades, if ever. Where did these come from? She shows them to me, Graham said. The lady made of light. She tells me that humanity is approaching a critical point and that we need to make certain choices if we want to survive. What kind of choices? How we relate to each other, how we treat the environment, how we handle the knowledge that we're not alone in the universe. Graham's voice grew quiet. She says that disclosure is coming, but not in the way people expect. It's going to happen through trauma, through crisis, because that's the only way humanity learns to change. Wren felt his worldview shifting. Everything in his scientific training told him that Graham was delusional, but the evidence suggested otherwise. The man was receiving information that he couldn't possibly have access to through normal means. Dr. Wren, Graham said, I need you to understand something. I'm not the only one. There are others like me, people who've been contacted and are receiving information. Your government knows about us, and they're studying us like lab animals. What do you want me to do about it? Stop treating us like subjects and start treating us like partners, because what's coming is going to affect everyone, and we're going to need all the help we can get. After the interview, Wren returned to Langley with more questions than answers. His report to Major Granger was carefully worded, but his conclusion was clear. Graham Ellison was in contact with an intelligence that possessed knowledge beyond current human understanding. What's your recommendation? Granger asked. We need to start taking this seriously, Wren said. If there are others like him, we need to find them and try to understand what they're being told. And if what they're being told is accurate, then we're dealing with something that could change everything we know about human civilization. Granger was quiet for a long moment. Dr. Wren, I'm going to upgrade your clearance to Umbra level. There are some things you need to know about what we're really dealing with. The briefing that followed changed everything Wren thought he knew about the government's interest in Graham Ellison. Project Threshold wasn't just monitoring psychic phenomena. It was part of a larger program designed to establish contact with non-human intelligences that had been observing humanity for decades. The entities were real, they were here, and they were trying to communicate. Graham Ellison wasn't just a subject of study. He was humanity's first ambassador to a civilization that existed beyond the boundaries of normal space and time. The question was, what did they want, and was humanity ready to hear the answer? 2008 se 2012. Graham Ellison had learned to live with the impossible. The woman made of starlight visited him with increasing frequency, sometimes in dreams, sometimes in waking visions that left him disoriented and filled with knowledge he couldn't possibly possess. She never gave him her name, and he'd begun thinking of her simply as the lady. Their conversations took place in a space that wasn't quite physical, but felt more real than ordinary reality. The lady appeared as a figure of pure light, her features shifting and flowing like water, but her presence was unmistakably feminine and deeply compassionate. You're afraid, she said during one of their early encounters. They were standing by the Cape Fear River, but it was the river as it had been centuries ago, clear and pristine, surrounded by ancient forest. Of course I'm afraid, Graham replied. I don't understand what's happening to me. You're becoming a conduit, the lady explained. A bridge between your species and ours. It's a natural process, but one that few of your kind are capable of sustaining. What do you want from me? To prepare your people for what's coming. Change is inevitable, but the form it takes depends on choices that haven't been made yet. Over the following months, the lady showed Graham visions of possible futures. Some were hopeful, humanity working together to solve environmental problems, developing new technologies that respected the natural world, reaching out to the stars with wisdom and humility. Others were terrifying. Ecological collapse, war, the breakdown of civilization itself. Which future will come to pass? Graham asked. That depends on you, the lady replied. All of you. The choices you make in the next few years will determine whether your species survives its adolescence. The visions began to manifest in Graham's daily life as specific, detailed prophecies. In March 2008, he woke from a dream about a massive oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, complete with images of burning platforms and dead wildlife. He wrote down everything he could remember, including the location and approximate timing. Late spring 2010. 2 years later, the Deepwater Horizon exploded on April 20th, 2010, in almost exactly the location Graham had seen in his vision. The prophecy that truly terrified him came in September 2009. The lady showed him images of military vehicles moving through American cities, people in face masks, and what appeared to be some kind of global crisis that would begin in late 2019 or early 2020. "What is this?" Graham asked. "A test," the lady replied. "Your species will face a challenge that requires cooperation and wisdom. How you respond will determine whether you're ready for contact." "Contact with who?" "With us. With the civilizations that have been watching you develop. You're not alone, Graham, but you're not ready to join the larger community. Not yet." Graham tried to document these visions, but he found that the government's surveillance of his life had intensified. His phone was obviously tapped, his mail was being intercepted, and there were always vehicles parked near his property. When he tried to share his experiences online, his posts were quickly deleted or buried by algorithm changes. The isolation was taking its toll. His wife had left him in 2009, unable to cope with the constant stress of government surveillance and her husband's increasingly erratic behaviour. His children visited less frequently, and his business was suffering as potential clients were scared away by the mysterious men in suits who seemed to follow him everywhere. In 2011, the lady's messages became more urgent. She showed him visions of advanced military technology that wouldn't be publicly revealed for years. Triangular aircraft that moved without visible propulsion, weapons that could disable electronics from a distance, and surveillance systems that tracked individual humans through their unique electromagnetic signatures. "They're trying to reverse engineer our technology," the lady explained. "Your government has recovered some of our vehicles and is attempting to understand how they work." Is that bad? It's dangerous. They're approaching the technology from a place of fear and aggression, not wisdom and cooperation. That path leads to destruction. Graham began to realise that his role wasn't just to receive information, but to serve as a conduit for a larger communication. The lady wasn't just showing him the future. She was trying to influence it by working through him and others like him. "How many others are there?" he asked. "Not many. Your species isn't naturally telepathic, but some individuals have the neurological flexibility to establish contact. You're one of the strongest we've encountered." The burden of this knowledge was overwhelming. Graham felt like he was carrying the weight of humanity's future on his shoulders, and the government's response suggested that they saw him as either a valuable asset or a dangerous threat. In 2012, the lady's final major prophecy came to pass with devastating accuracy. She'd shown him images of what appeared to be a school shooting, complete with specific details about the location and timing. Graham had tried to warn authorities, but his calls were dismissed as the ramblings of a known conspiracy theorist. When the Sandy Hook shooting occurred almost exactly as the lady had predicted, Graham realised that his warnings weren't being ignored. They were being suppressed. The government knew about his abilities, but they were more interested in studying him than in preventing the tragedies he foresaw. "Why won't you stop these things from happening?" Graham asked the lady during one of their conversations. "Because they're necessary," she replied sadly. "Your species learns through trauma and crisis. These events are terrible, but they're also catalysts for change. Without them, humanity would remain stagnant." "So you're just going to let people die?" "We don't control your world, Graham. We can only observe and try to guide. The choices are yours to make." The lady's messages became less frequent after 2012, but more philosophical. She spoke about the nature of consciousness, the connection between all living things, and humanity's potential role in a galactic community that existed beyond the physical universe. "You think of us as aliens," she said during one of their last conversations, "but we're not separate from you. We're what you might become if you choose the path of wisdom over the path of fear." "What happens if we choose fear?" "Then you'll destroy yourselves, and we'll wait for the next species to evolve to the point where contact becomes possible." Graham realised that the lady's visits were both a gift and a test. Humanity was being evaluated, and the results would determine whether the species was ready to join a larger community of consciousness that spanned the galaxy. The question was, would they pass the test, or would they fail like so many others before them? 2013. The anonymous meeting took place in a parking garage in Arlington, Virginia, at midnight on a Tuesday in February. Rowan Knox had been investigating the Ellison case for 6 years, but her source had never agreed to meet in person until now. The man who approached her car was older than she had expected, probably in his 60s, with silver hair and the kind of bearing that suggested military service. He wore a dark overcoat and carried a leather briefcase that looked expensive but well worn. "Ms. Knox," he said, sliding into the passenger seat. "Thank you for coming." "I still don't know who you are," Rowan said. "Let's just say I'm someone who's spent most of his career in rooms that don't officially exist, dealing with problems that can't be publicly acknowledged." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder marked with classifications that Rowan had never seen before. "What I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible, but I assure you that every word is documented and verified." "I'm listening." The United States government has been in contact with non-human intelligences for over 70 years, not through crashed spacecraft or abducted civilians, but through individuals like Graham Ellison who serve as communication conduits. Rowan felt her worldview tilting. "You're talking about telepathic contact. We prefer the term consciousness interface," the man said. "These beings exist primarily as pure consciousness, though they can manifest physical forms when necessary. They've been observing human civilization and occasionally making contact with individuals who have the neurological capacity to receive their communications." "How many people know about this?" "Very few. There's a doctrine called compartmented non-disclosure that keeps this information restricted to a small circle of officials across multiple agencies. Most people in government don't even know it exists." He pulled out a photograph showing what appeared to be a meeting room with several military officers seated around a table. At the head of the table was a figure that seemed to be composed of shifting light. "This was taken in 1987, he said. Direct contact with an entity the committee designated as Mentor 7. The meeting lasted 4 hours and covered topics ranging from nuclear weapons to environmental policy. What did they want? To prevent humanity from destroying itself. These beings have watched numerous civilizations reach our level of technological development, and most don't survive the transition. They're trying to help us avoid that fate." Rowan studied the photograph. The figure at the head of the table was clearly not human, but there was something oddly familiar about it. "This looks like the entity that Ellison describes." "Graham isn't the first contact, but he's one of the most receptive. Most people who experience direct contact suffer psychological breakdown within months. Graham has maintained stable communication for over 6 years. What makes him different?" "Genetic factors, probably. His neurological structure seems naturally adapted for this kind of communication. We've identified maybe 24 individuals worldwide with similar capabilities." The man pulled out another document, this one marked Observer Project Classification Umbra/White. The pages were heavily redacted, but Rowan could make out references to beacon subjects, consciousness mapping, and strategic communication protocols. "The Observer Project is the current iteration of our contact program," he explained. "We monitor individuals who show signs of contact and try to understand how the communication works. The ultimate goal is to establish direct controlled contact without needing human intermediaries. And Graham doesn't know about this. He suspects, but he doesn't know the full scope. We've been careful to maintain the illusion that he's being studied for conventional reasons." Rowan felt sick. "You're using him." "We're protecting him," the man corrected. "Do you have any idea what would happen if this information became public? Religious fundamentalists would declare him either a prophet or a demon. Governments around the world would try to kidnap or kill him. His only protection is our secrecy. What about the information he's receiving? The prophecies? All accurate, as far as we can verify. The entities seem to have access to information about future probabilities that our best intelligence analysts can't match. They've warned us about terrorist attacks, natural disasters, even market crashes. Then why don't you act on those warnings? The man's expression grew grim, because acting on them would reveal that we have access to prophetic information. That would expose the entire program. So we document the predictions, verify their accuracy, and try to learn how the system works. While people die, while we try to understand something that could determine the survival of our species, these beings aren't omnipotent, Ms. Knox. They can show us possible futures, but they can't force us to make better choices. Rowan realised that she was looking at a shadow government that operated beyond the normal structure of democratic oversight. A group of officials who believed they were protecting humanity by managing contact with non-human intelligence, even if it meant sacrificing individual lives for the greater good. Why are you telling me this? Because the situation is changing. The entities are becoming more active, making contact with more individuals. The old model of compartmented secrecy isn't going to work much longer. What's coming? Disclosure. Not the kind that UFO researchers imagine, but something much more significant. The entities are preparing to make themselves known to humanity as a whole, and they're using people like Graham to prepare the way. The man closed his briefcase and prepared to leave. Miss Knox, I want you to understand something. What you've learned tonight makes you a person of interest to very powerful people. Your investigation into Graham Ellison has brought you to the attention of agencies that don't officially exist. Is that a threat? It's a reality. From now on, you'll be watched, monitored, and evaluated. How you handle this information will determine whether you're seen as an asset or a liability. After he left, Rowan sat in her car for a long time, trying to process what she had learned. The government wasn't covering up evidence of non-human intelligence. They were managing humanity's introduction to a galactic community that existed beyond physical space. Graham Ellison wasn't just a contact subject. He was humanity's first ambassador to a civilization that had been watching and guiding human development for centuries. And Rowan Knox, investigative journalist, had just become part of the most significant story in human history. The question was, what was she going to do about it? 2013 se 2018. The Halford Dynamics trailer arrived on a Thursday morning in October 2013, delivered by a team of technicians who spoke in clipped professional tones and avoided eye contact with Graham Ellison. They positioned the unmarked white trailer at the edge of his property, explaining that it was part of a long-term atmospheric monitoring study being conducted in partnership with several government agencies. Graham watched them work from his kitchen window, noting the sophisticated equipment they installed around the trailer: satellite dishes, atmospheric sensors, and what appeared to be some kind of electromagnetic detection array. The setup looked more like a military surveillance post than a weather station. "Mr. Ellison," the lead technician said when they finished, "this equipment will be completely automated. You won't hear any noise and it won't interfere with your daily activities. We'll check on it monthly, but otherwise you can ignore it." "What exactly are you monitoring?" "Atmospheric conditions, electromagnetic fluctuations, that sort of thing. Standard environmental data collection." After they left, Graham walked around the trailer studying its construction. The windows were tinted black, making it impossible to see inside, and the door was secured with electronic locks that required keycard access. Whatever was inside, it wasn't standard weather monitoring equipment. That night, the lady appeared to him for the first time in months. "They're listening more carefully now," she said. They were standing in the ethereal version of his backyard, but the landscape was different. The trees were taller, older, and the sky had a quality that reminded Graham of deep space. What are they listening for? "Our conversations. They've learned that consciousness creates electromagnetic patterns, and they're trying to record and decode our communications." "Can they do that?" "Not yet, but they're developing the technology. Dr. Wren believes that consciousness operates on quantum frequencies that can be detected and possibly replicated. Graham felt a chill. They want to talk to you directly. Yes, but they approach from a place of fear and desire for control. Direct contact with us requires openness, trust, and the willingness to accept that your species is not the dominant intelligence in this region of space. What happens if they succeed? Depending on their intentions, either a great leap forward for humanity, or the beginning of a conflict that your species cannot win. Over the following months, Graham noticed changes in his ability to communicate with the lady. Their conversations became shorter and less frequent, often interrupted by what felt like electronic interference. Sometimes he would wake from a dream knowing that she had tried to contact him, but unable to remember what she'd said. The surveillance around his property intensified. The monthly equipment checks became weekly, then daily. Graham began to recognize the faces of the technicians, noting that they were too fit and too alert to be simple contractors. These were intelligence operatives, probably military. In 2014, Graham made the decision to stop speaking publicly about his experiences. He deleted his online accounts, stopped responding to researchers, and told his remaining friends and family that he wanted to put the whole experience behind him. To outside observers, it appeared that he had lost interest in his UFO experiences and returned to a normal life. The truth was more complex. The lady had asked him to maintain silence while she and her kind evaluated humanity's readiness for broader contact. His public statements had been monitored and analysed by governments around the world, and the response had been troubling. Your leaders see us as either a threat to be neutralised or a resource to be exploited, the lady explained during one of their few uninterrupted conversations. They cannot conceive of a relationship based on mutual respect and cooperation. What about ordinary people? Many are ready, but they're not the ones making decisions about how your species responds to contact. During the years of public silence, Graham's private experiences with the lady intensified. She showed him visions of advanced civilizations throughout the galaxy, some that had successfully made the transition to what she called galactic citizenship, and others that had destroyed themselves through fear and aggression. What determines which path a species takes? Graham asked. Their relationship with consciousness itself. Species that understand that consciousness is the fundamental force in the universe learn to cooperate and evolve. Those that remain trapped in material thinking inevitably destroy themselves. Which category do humans fall into? That's still being determined. You're at a critical juncture. The next decade will reveal whether your species has the wisdom to survive its own technological power. The visions Graham received during this period were more abstract than his earlier prophecies, dealing with fundamental questions about the nature of reality rather than specific future events. The lady showed him that consciousness was not produced by the brain, but was rather a universal field that brains could access under the right conditions. Your scientists are beginning to understand this, she said. Quantum mechanics is revealing that consciousness plays a fundamental role in determining physical reality. When they fully grasp this principle, they'll be ready for contact. How long will that take? For the scientists, perhaps a generation. For your governments, much longer. They're too invested in maintaining control through secrecy and force. In 2016, Graham began to experience what he could only describe as interference in his communications with the lady. Their conversations were increasingly interrupted by bursts of static, electromagnetic noise, and sometimes what sounded like human voices speaking in technical jargon. They're getting closer, the lady warned him. Dr. Wren has developed equipment that can detect our communications, even if he can't decode them yet. What should I do? Prepare for a period of silence. We may need to suspend contact until the situation stabilizes. The last clear communication Graham received from the lady came in late 2017. She appeared to him one final time, but her image was flickering and unstable, like a television signal breaking up. The disclosure is beginning, she said, not through government announcements, but through the gradual revelation of our presence to your military and intelligence agencies. They will resist this knowledge, but eventually they will have no choice but to acknowledge it. What about people like me? You've served your purpose as a bridge, but the next phase requires direct contact between our civilizations. Your role may be ending, but your contribution will not be forgotten. Will I see you again? When your species is ready, we will return. But for now, we must step back and allow humanity to make its own choices about its future. After that, silence. Graham continued to have dreams that felt significant, but the clear, detailed communications from the lady stopped entirely. The ethereal woman who had guided him for over a decade had withdrawn, leaving him feeling isolated and purposeless. The surveillance continued, but it had a different quality now. The observers seemed less interested in what Graham was experiencing and more focused on monitoring his environment for signs of ongoing contact. They knew the communications had stopped, and they were trying to understand why. Graham realised that he had become a relic of an earlier phase of contact, a bridge that was no longer needed. The lady and her kind had moved on to the next stage of their plan, whatever that might be. All he could do was wait and watch as the world began to change in ways that most people didn't yet understand. 2020. The world began to unravel in March 2020, exactly as the lady had shown Graham in her visions 12 years earlier. The pandemic swept across the globe with devastating efficiency, bringing human civilization to a standstill and forcing governments to confront the fragility of their carefully constructed systems. Graham watched the unfolding crisis from his isolated property in North Carolina, recognising each development as something the lady had prepared him for. The lockdowns, the economic disruption, the social unrest that followed, all of it had been foreseen and explained as a necessary catalyst for humanity's next evolutionary step. Dr. Elias Wner arrived unannounced on a cold February morning in 2021. Graham hadn't seen the physicist in over 3 years, but the man who stood at his door looked like he'd aged a decade. His hair was completely grey now, his face deeply lined, and his eyes had the haunted quality of someone who'd seen too much. "Mr. Ellison," Wren said, "we need to talk." They sat in Graham's kitchen, drinking coffee while snow fell outside the window. Wren seemed nervous, constantly checking his phone and glancing toward the windows as if expecting surveillance. "The project has changed," Wren said without preamble. "What started as scientific research has become something else entirely." "What do you mean?" "There are factions within the intelligence community that want to weaponize contact with the entities. They believe that if they can establish direct communication, they can gain access to advanced technology and use it for military purposes." Graham felt a familiar chill. "That's exactly what the lady warned me about." "The lady?" Wren leaned forward. "You've had recent contact." "Not for years, but she told me this would happen. She said that humans would approach their technology from a place of fear and aggression, and that it would lead to disaster." Wren was quiet for a long moment. "Mr. Ellison, I need you to know that there are people in very high places who see you as either an asset to be exploited or a threat to be eliminated. The fact that your contact has ceased makes some of them nervous." "Why?" "Because they think it means the entities have given up on humanity. And if that's true, then all the resources we've invested in understanding this phenomenon have been wasted. Or," Graham said slowly, "it means that the entities are preparing for the next phase." "What next phase?" "Direct contact. Not through intermediaries like me, but with humanity as a whole. The lady told me that disclosure would come through trauma and crisis, because that's the only way our species learns to change." Wren's expression grew grim. "If that's true, then we're about to enter a very dangerous period, because there are people who will do anything to prevent that kind of disclosure from happening." Over the following months, Graham noticed increased activity around his property. The Halford Dynamics trailer was upgraded with new equipment, and the number of surveillance vehicles in the area doubled. It felt like the calm before a storm. The breakthrough came in the form of a dream unlike any Graham had experienced since the lady's departure. He found himself standing in what appeared to be a vast amphitheatre, filled with beings of light, all of them focused on a central figure who radiated authority and compassion. "Graham Ellison," the figure said, its voice resonating through his consciousness like a bell. "You have served as a faithful bridge between our civilizations. Now the time has come for the next phase of contact. What do you want me to do? Tell your species that we are here, that we have always been here, and that we come in peace. But also tell them that their leaders' attempts to weaponize our technology will not be permitted. They won't listen to me. I'm just one person. You won't be alone. Others are receiving this same message. The disclosure is beginning and it cannot be stopped. Graham woke with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The lady and her kind hadn't abandoned humanity. They had been preparing for this moment. The pandemic, the social unrest, the breakdown of old systems, all of it had been necessary to create the conditions for a new kind of contact. He spent the following weeks documenting his final vision, writing down every detail he could remember. When he finished, he had a document that read like a manifesto, a declaration that humanity was not alone and that the time for secrecy was ending. On March 15th, 2022, Graham posted his final message to a dozen online forums and social media platforms. To anyone who reads this, I want you to know that we are not alone in the universe. For the past 15 years, I have been in contact with intelligences that exist beyond our normal understanding of reality. They have been watching humanity develop, and they have been trying to guide us toward a future where we can join a larger community of conscious beings. Our governments know about this contact. They have been studying people like me for decades, trying to understand how to communicate with these entities directly. But they approach from a place of fear and desire for control, and that approach will only lead to conflict. The entities I've communicated with are not our enemies. They are our potential mentors, teachers who want to help us avoid the mistakes that have destroyed other civilizations. But they will not force their help on us. The choice is ours to make. I'm sharing this information because I believe that the time for secrecy is ending. What's coming will affect all of us, and we deserve to know the truth. They've always been here. What we thought was divine was never separate from the stars. Watch the skies, watch for signs, and remember that consciousness is the fundamental force in the universe. Everything else is just details. Within hours, the post had been viewed thousands of times and shared across multiple platforms, but by the next morning, it had vanished from the internet entirely, removed by automated systems that flagged it as potentially harmful misinformation. Graham wasn't surprised. He had expected the suppression, even prepared for it. The message wasn't really intended for the general public anyway. It was a signal, a beacon lit for others like him who had been waiting for permission to speak. 2 weeks later, Graham Ellison disappeared. His truck was found parked at the Cape Fear River, in the exact spot where he'd first encountered the lights 15 years earlier. There were no signs of struggle, no indication of foul play. His wallet, keys and cell phone were still in the vehicle, but Graham himself was gone. The official investigation concluded that he had probably drowned, though his body was never found. Local authorities noted that the river had been running high due to recent rains, and suggested that he might have fallen in while fishing. But those who knew the real story suspected something different. Graham Ellison hadn't drowned. He had been taken, either by the entities he'd spent years communicating with, or by the government agencies that had been monitoring him. The truth, as always, remained classified. 3 months after Graham Ellison's disappearance, a package arrived at Rowan Knox's apartment in Arlington, Virginia. There was no return address, no postmark, and no indication of how it had been delivered. It simply appeared on her doorstep one morning, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Inside was a hard drive and a note written in Graham's unmistakable handwriting. For when the time is right, they're coming home. GE double quote. Rowan had been expecting something like this. Her investigation into the Ellison case had taught her that nothing in this story ended cleanly. There were always loose threads, hidden documents, and final revelations that arrived when you least expected them. She connected the hard drive to an isolated computer, one that wasn't connected to the internet or any network. The files it contained made her question everything she thought she knew about the nature of reality. The first folder contained medical scans of Graham's brain and nervous system, taken over a period of 15 years. The images showed progressive changes in his neural structure, with new pathways forming in regions associated with telepathic and psychic phenomena. It was as if his contact with the entities had physically rewired his consciousness. The second folder contained surveillance footage from cameras around Graham's property. The video showed the lights he'd described, but they also revealed something else. The lights were responding to Graham's presence, forming patterns and configurations that suggested deliberate communication. In one particularly striking sequence, the lights arranged themselves into geometric shapes that matched the symbols Graham had been drawing in his notebooks. The entities weren't just communicating through visions and dreams. They were creating physical manifestations that could be recorded and studied. The third folder contained classified documents marked Observer Project Clearance Umbra/White. These files detailed a government program that had been monitoring individuals with psychic abilities for over 40 years, building a database of people who could potentially serve as communication conduits with non-human intelligence. But the most shocking revelation came in the final folder: transcripts of communications between government officials and the entities themselves. The documents revealed that direct contact had been established as early as 1987, and that ongoing negotiations had been taking place about the terms of disclosure. The entities had been patient, working through intermediaries like Graham, while government officials debated how to manage the revelation of their presence. But that patience was running out. The final document was dated just 1 week before Graham's disappearance. It was a communication from the entities to a classified government committee, and its message was unambiguous. The period of gradual introduction is ending. We have attempted to work within your governmental structures to prepare humanity for disclosure, but your continued focus on control and weaponization makes cooperation impossible. We are therefore initiating direct contact protocols. This will not be a hostile action, but it will not require your permission or cooperation. Humanity will learn of our presence through direct experience, not through managed government disclosure. The time for secrecy is over. Rowan realised that Graham's disappearance hadn't been the end of the story. It had been the beginning of something much larger. The entities were moving to the next phase of their plan, and the governments that had spent decades trying to control the contact were about to lose all influence over the process. She spent weeks analysing the files, cross-referencing them with her own research and looking for patterns that might predict what would happen next. The picture that emerged was both thrilling and terrifying. The entities were planning a series of public manifestations that would make their presence undeniable. Not aggressive demonstrations, but unmistakable proof that humanity was not alone in the universe. They would appear over major cities, communicate directly with world leaders, and make it clear that the age of human isolation was ending. But they were also prepared for resistance. The files suggested that they had contingency plans for dealing with military responses, and that they possessed technology that could neutralize human weapons without causing casualties. It would be disclosure on their terms, not humanity's. Rowan was still analysing the files when she had her first direct experience with the entities. It happened on a Tuesday night in October, as she was working late in her apartment. She noticed a soft glow outside her window and looked up to see 3 orbs of light hovering motionless above the parking lot. The orbs pulsed in unison, and suddenly Rowan found herself standing in the ethereal space that Graham had described in his writings. She was by the Cape Fear River, but it was the river as it existed in some other dimension, surrounded by ancient trees under a sky filled with stars. A figure approached her from the tree line. It was the lady, the same entity that had communicated with Graham for over a decade. She appeared as a woman made of starlight, beautiful and serene, with eyes that held the wisdom of ages. "Rowan Knox," the lady said, her voice like music. "You have served as a chronicler of the bridge between our worlds. Now you will serve as a witness to the next phase. What's going to happen? What should have happened long ago? Direct contact between our civilizations. Your governments have had their chance to manage this process responsibly, but they have chosen the path of fear and control. Will there be conflict? Only if your leaders choose it. We come in peace. but we will not be denied or dismissed. Humanity is ready for contact, even if its governments are not." The lady gestured toward the sky, and Rowan saw what appeared to be a vast network of light-connecting stars across the galaxy. "This is the community you will join if you choose wisdom over fear, consciousness connected across space and time, working together to nurture life and understanding throughout the universe." "What's my role in this?" "To tell the story, to help your species understand that what's coming is not an invasion, but an invitation. We are offering humanity a choice: remain isolated and eventually destroy yourselves, or join the larger community and help us nurture consciousness throughout the galaxy." When the vision ended, Rowan found herself back in her apartment, staring out at an empty parking lot. But she knew that everything had changed. The story she'd been investigating for over 15 years was entering its final chapter, and she was going to have a front row seat. Over the following weeks, reports began to appear of similar encounters around the world. People in major cities reported seeing lights in the sky that responded to their thoughts and emotions. Scientists at research facilities found their equipment detecting signals that couldn't be explained by conventional physics. Religious leaders reported visions and prophetic dreams that all carried the same message: something momentous was approaching. The governments of the world tried to suppress these reports, but the sheer volume of encounters made concealment impossible. Social media platforms were flooded with videos of unexplained lights, and conspiracy forums buzzed with theories about impending disclosure. But Rowan knew it wasn't a conspiracy. It was an inevitability. The entities that had been watching humanity develop for centuries were finally ready to make themselves known, and no amount of government secrecy could stop what was coming. The beacon that Graham Ellison had lit 15 years earlier by the Cape Fear River had done its job. It had served as a bridge between two civilizations, preparing the way for a contact that would change everything humanity thought it knew about its place in the universe. Now all that remained was to see whether humanity would choose wisdom or fear when faced with the greatest revelation in its history. The lights were coming home, and the age of human isolation was about to end. As Rowan finished documenting the files from Graham's hard drive, she felt a familiar presence in her room. She looked up to see a soft glow emanating from her window, pulsing gently like a heartbeat. The lady had kept her promise to return. The cycle was beginning again, but this time it wouldn't end with a single beacon. This time the entire world would witness the light. The beacon at Cape Fear had served its purpose. Now it was time for humanity to decide what kind of future it wanted to create. And somewhere, in a place beyond normal space and time, Graham Ellison watched and waited to see what choice his species would make. The end was only the beginning.